Imagine this scene: a deep winter night. Outside, the wind howls endlessly, pressing against ancient stone walls. You are lying in a medieval castle, a fortress built of rock so thick that the cold seems to live inside it. No central heating, no electricity, not even modern glass in the windows. Sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? Films and novels have taught us to believe that medieval castles were nothing more than frozen prisons, places where people shivered through every night, wrapped in despair and fur. But if life inside these stone fortresses was truly unbearable, how did people live there for centuries? Not just survive, but raise families, govern lands, and even flourish. Were medieval nobles simply immune to cold? Or is there something important we've misunderstood? Today, let's take apart one of the most persistent myths of the Middle Ages: the idea that castles were permanent refrigerators, where comfort was impossible. In reality, medieval builders were far more clever than we often give them credit for. They understood warmth, insulation, and airflow surprisingly well, and used a whole system of techniques to make stone buildings livable, even in harsh winters. So, where did the myth of icy castles come from? Largely from later centuries. In the 18th and 19th centuries, people encountered castles mostly as ruins, roofless, empty, exposed to wind and rain, without windows, doors, or inner walls. Any stone structure feels unbearably cold. But step into a well-preserved castle, Warwick Castle in England, or Pierrefonds in France, and you may be surprised by how enclosed and sheltered it feels. One of the biggest secrets lies in the walls themselves. Those massive stone walls, sometimes up to 4 meters thick, were not a flaw, they were a feature. Stone acts like a thermal battery. During the day, it absorbs heat from sunlight and fireplaces. At night, it slowly releases that stored warmth back into the rooms. The result is not sudden heat, but a steady, gentle warmth that lasts for hours. Medieval architects also thought carefully about layout. Living quarters were never placed randomly. Bedrooms for the nobility were usually located on upper floors, where warm air naturally rose from the rooms below. The higher your social status, the warmer your sleeping chamber. Castles were often oriented toward the sun as well. Living spaces faced south to capture daylight and warmth, while storage rooms, stables, and armories were placed on the colder northern side, forming a natural barrier against icy winds. Windows, too, were designed with intention. In private chambers, they were narrow and deep, letting in light during the day while preventing heat from escaping at night. Wooden shutters and heavy curtains added another layer of insulation. Inside, ceilings in living rooms were often much lower than we imagine, around 2.5 meters, reducing the amount of air that needed to be warmed. Grand halls had high vaults for ceremony and spectacle, but daily life happened in smaller, more practical spaces. Even air movement was carefully considered. Some castles included buffer rooms, corridors, and inner chambers that worked like airlocks, preventing cold drafts from rushing straight into living areas. taken together, these choices formed a complete system. Architecture, physics, and daily habits working in harmony. So no, medieval castles were not frozen tombs of stone. They were carefully designed shelters, imperfect by modern standards. Yes, but far from unlivable. Stone by stone, medieval people turned fortresses into homes. There was one more clever detail. Fireplaces were rarely placed in the middle of a wall. Most often, they were built into the corners of rooms. Why the corners? Because a single chimney could serve 2 adjacent chambers at once. An efficient solution in a stone building. And the corner of a room is naturally the most protected place, sheltered from drafts and cold air. In Glamis Castle in Scotland, you can still see corner fireplaces from the 13th century. They functioned almost like compact heating stations, warming multiple rooms through shared stonework. So the next time you see a medieval castle, don't rush to pity its inhabitants. Instead, admire the ingenuity of people who, without electricity or modern technology, created livable and even comfortable homes in harsh climates. Now that we've explored architectural tricks, it's time to meet the true hero of medieval comfort, fire itself. And here, another surprise awaits us. It turns out medieval people understood heating far better than we usually assume. Using nothing more than wood, charcoal, and clever design, they managed to keep vast stone structures warm. Let's begin by debunking another common myth. The idea that castles had only one fireplace in a great hall, while everyone else froze in dark corners. That simply isn't true. In some castles, archaeologists have identified dozens of fireplaces and hearths. In royal residences like Windsor Castle, there were even more. Medieval nobility knew perfectly well. If you wanted to live comfortably, every living space needed its own source of heat. But what truly matters is how these fireplaces were built. Forget the image of open fires filling rooms with smoke. As early as the 12th century, fireplaces with chimneys became common. By the 14th century, they were sophisticated pieces of engineering. Some surviving examples still function today. Their chimneys were designed to create natural draft, efficiently pulling smoke upward while keeping warmth inside the room. Even more impressive, medieval builders invented early versions of enclosed stoves. In parts of Central Europe, archaeologists have uncovered tiled stoves with internal flue systems. Hot smoke didn't escape immediately, but traveled through internal channels, releasing as much heat as possible before exiting. These systems were far more efficient than open fireplaces. But how did they keep the fire going through the night? Wood burns quickly, and waking every 2 hours to feed a fire doesn't make for good sleep. Here, medieval households showed remarkable creativity. First, they used special night logs, thick oak pieces designed to smolder slowly for up to 8 hours. Such logs were prepared specifically for overnight heating. Second, they relied on charcoal, Once properly lit, charcoal burned evenly and for a long time, providing steady warmth. Of course, it required caution. Charcoal braziers were placed in ventilated niches or used in metal containers with multiple openings to reduce risk. And now for a curious detail. Who was responsible for keeping the fire alive? In large castles, there was often a dedicated role, the keeper of the fire. This person made rounds before bedtime, checking fireplaces, adding fuel, and ensuring proper draft. In some castles, written instructions even survive, detailing the order of rooms, the amount of fuel for each hearth, and what to do if a sleeping lord was disturbed. Fire safety was also taken seriously. Fireplaces were surrounded by stone or brick screens. Buckets of water or sand were kept nearby. Some castles even had primitive fire control systems, using channels to redirect water quickly. In wealthier chambers, special night fireplaces were installed, small but efficient, with metal dampers. Before sleep, the damper was partially closed, allowing the fire to smolder slowly while still producing heat. In the morning, opening it and adding fresh wood was enough to bring the fire back to life. But warmth alone wasn't enough. Medieval people understood that good sleep also depended on air quality. Dry heat could irritate the lungs and throat. To prevent this, bowls of water were often placed near fireplaces, simple but effective humidifiers. Sometimes herbs were added to the water, filling rooms with gentle, natural aromas. Fire, then, was not just a heat source. It was the heart of domestic comfort. And now, let's move to the most intimate place in a medieval castle, the bed. Here, fans of harsh medieval myths may feel disappointed. Nobles often slept far more comfortably than many people do today. Forget the idea of a hard wooden bench covered with straw. While peasants slept that way, castle life followed very different rules. Inventories from royal residences describe beds composed of numerous layers, sometimes more than 10 mattresses of varying density. At the base stood a wooden frame, assembled without nails, using wooden pegs and wedges. This made the bed easy to dismantle for travel, and nobles traveled often, bringing their beds with them. Leather straps or ropes formed the first flexible layer. Above that came wool-filled mattresses, chosen not by accident. Wool retains heat even in damp conditions and naturally resists bacteria. Then came layers upon layers of linen, down-filled mattresses, blankets, and quilts. Each had a purpose. Lower layers insulated against cold. Upper layers provided softness and warmth. Multiple sheets allowed for easy cleaning without dismantling the entire structure. Pillows were used generously, not one, but many. Large square ones supported the back. Smaller ones cradled the neck. Long bolster pillows were placed along the body for additional warmth. Materials varied. The most prized fillings were swan and eider down. More modest households used goose feathers, and simpler ones relied on chicken feathers. For summer, pillows filled with fragrant herbs were common. Lavender, thyme, mint. They smelled pleasant and helped repel insects. Blankets received special attention as well. Winter beds might include several layers: linen, wool, fur, and silk, each adding insulation. Fur blankets were particularly practical. The fur faced inward for warmth, while the outside was covered with fine fabric, creating a blanket that was warm, light, and beautiful. Layer by layer, medieval people built a sleeping environment designed not for suffering, but for rest. Inventories from the Chateau of Chartres even mention a blanket lined with marten fur and covered in crimson silk. Sleeping beneath it must have been not only warm, but deeply pleasant. Now comes the most interesting part: how all this luxury was actually used. In winter, the bed became a true fortress against the cold. Before anyone lay down, the mattress was preheated using brass warming pans filled with hot coals. They were carefully slid between the sheets, warming the bedding from within. Only after that did people climb into bed. And then began the ritual of layering. Blanket after blanket, quilt after quilt, like wrapping oneself inside a cabbage of warmth. In summer, everything changed. Extra layers were removed. Only the essentials remained. On hot nights, people slept almost directly on linen sheets, and wool mattresses were sometimes replaced with ones stuffed with flax tow, which stayed cooler. But what about insects? Surely medieval aristocrats had to tolerate fleas and bedbugs. Not at all. Bed linen was regularly boiled with wormwood and tansy, herbs known for repelling insects. Between mattresses, small sachets filled with lavender, rosemary, and other fragrant plants were placed. So the medieval bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a carefully designed climate control system, adaptable to any season. Now it's time to address perhaps the most persistent and most scandalous myth of medieval sleep: the idea that people slept completely naked. Where did this strange fantasy come from? Perhaps someone once found it romantic to imagine nights and ladies lying unclothed in icy stone chambers. The truth, as usual, is far more practical. In medieval society, nudity was considered sinful and improper. The church strongly discouraged any display of the naked body, even during sleep. Sleeping without clothing was seen as nearly as unacceptable as appearing naked in church. Medieval physicians added their own warnings. They believed that an uncovered body during sleep attracted illness and harmful vapors. So what did people actually wear to bed? Prepare to be surprised. Nightwear could be just as elaborate as daytime clothing. The foundation of a nobleman's night attire was a long linen or fine wool shirt called a chemise. It reached the knees or even the ankles. Royal inventories mention entire wardrobes of such night garments, not for luxury, but for hygiene. While one was washed, another was worn. Women's night shirts were even longer and more flowing. Surviving examples from the 14th century show garments nearly 1.5 meters long, with wide sleeves and embroidered hems. Sleeping in such clothing was not only warm, but ceremonial. The true secret of medieval night fashion, however, was layering. In winter, a sleeveless overgarment was worn atop the nightshirt, often lined with fur. On especially cold nights, an additional robe was added, creating a textile cocoon around the body. Headwear played an equally important role. Men commonly slept in soft wool nightcaps, sometimes with long tails that could be wrapped around the neck for extra warmth. Some nobles owned dozens of nightcaps, each suited to a different season. Women's sleep headwear was even more elaborate. Married women rarely removed their linen caps. Even at night, modesty demanded it. In winter, a fur-lined bonnet was worn on top. And then there were the socks. Yes, medieval sleep socks. Inventories mention special night stockings made of wool or even silk. They reached the knees and were tied with ribbons. Wealthy households owned multiple pairs, thicker ones for winter, lighter ones for summer. Underneath all this, people also wore undergarments. Men slept in loose linen breeches. Women wore long linen undertunics, early predecessors of modern underwear. And nightwear was rarely plain. Dowry lists describe embroidered nightshirts, pearl-decorated caps, and silk robes trimmed with fur. Sleeping beautifully mattered just as much as dressing well during the day. In the coldest weather, extra accessories appeared. Sleeve warmers protected the arms. Fur-lined slippers were worn even in bed. Finally, scent played an important role. Night garments were stored in chests with sachets of rose, lavender, and mint. Some fabrics were lightly infused with incense, so medieval sleepwear was not only practical, it was warm, elegant, and fragrant. Now we come to one of the most delicate, yet essential aspects of medieval sleep. Who slept with whom? Forget modern ideas of privacy and personal space. In the Middle Ages, survival mattered more than modesty, and body heat was a precious resource. The first surprise: medieval beds were enormous. Some surviving examples from the 15th century measure nearly 3 meters wide. Why? Because they were meant for many sleepers. Married couples shared their beds, of course, but children often joined them as well, sometimes up to 10 or 12 years old. In some noble households, attendants and companions slept alongside their lady for warmth and safety. Young knights and squires commonly shared beds with one another. Refusing to do so could be seen as rude or miserly. Servants, too, played their part. Trusted attendants often slept on pallets near the Lord's bed, not as a punishment, but as a privilege. The master's chamber was the warmest room in the castle. Some bedrooms in winter became crowded with people, attendants, guards, even musicians, ready to soothe a sleepless noble with gentle music, a human radiator, spreading warmth through the night. Women's chambers were rarely empty. Noblewomen slept surrounded by attendants, especially during illness, pregnancy, or childbirth. And then there were the animals. Dogs were the most common, small lap dogs bred specifically for warmth. They were called bed dogs and served not only as heaters, but as flea attractors, drawing parasites away from humans. Cats were welcome too, warm, quiet, and excellent at keeping rodents away. In some places, lambs were brought into bedrooms during winter nights. They were clean, warm, and surprisingly calm. More unusual companions also appear in chronicles: ferrets, prized for their warmth and ability to curl into the coziest spots. There's even a story of a lord who tried sleeping with a piglet, an experiment that ended noisily and was never repeated. The church, interestingly, tolerated such practices. Some theologians even argued that animals were created to serve humanity, including by warming them at night. Of course, this system had risks. Animals could disturb sleep or spread illness. But in a world without central heating, every source of warmth mattered. And finally, we reach the last layer of medieval nighttime comfort: evening rituals. People didn't simply climb into bed and hope for the best. They followed routines designed to warm the body before sleep. And it all began with warm drinks. Forget simple mulled wine, mud-puddle imagination. New dozens of bedtime elixirs, mixtures that warmed the body, calmed the mind, and prepared the soul for rest, often infused with honey, herbs, and a touch of aromatic spices. A small goblet of this elixir would be sipped slowly while seated near a brazier or fireplace, letting the heat seep into chilled fingers and toes. Some recipes even called for warming ingredients like ginger or cinnamon, believed to chase away dampness and keep the humors balanced. Next came gentle movement, a short stroll around the chamber, or simple stretching of the arms and legs. Knights might perform light exercises to loosen the armor of the day, while noblemen smoothed their robes and arranged their hair. Every motion had a purpose: to release tension, improve circulation, and prepare the body for sleep's embrace. Bathing, when available, was a rare but treasured ritual. Warm water scented with rosemary, lavender, or rose petals washed away the day's fatigue. Afterward, skin was dried carefully, and night garments, freshly aired or warmed on the hearth, were donned. Some households even kept small warming bricks or heated tiles near the bed, so the chill of stone floors wouldn't disturb slumber. Light and sound were equally important. Candles, flickering in sconces or candelabras, cast a soft glow across tapestries and wooden panels. Music might play quietly: a lute, a harp, or the soothing drone of a hurdy-gurdy. Stories were whispered, prayers were murmured, and only the gentlest sounds were allowed to linger in the night air. Even the bed itself was a stage for careful preparation. Feathers were plumped, blankets fluffed, and mattresses rotated. The linen, sometimes perfumed with lavender or rosewater, smelled fresh and inviting. Every layer had a role, every fold a purpose, creating a cocoon that was not only warm but safe, comfortable, and reassuring. And when the moment came to lie down, it was a deliberate act. Sheets and blankets were arranged meticulously, nightcaps pulled snugly over ears, and hands tucked under layers. In the largest beds, bodies nestled together, a nobleman, his family, attendants, and sometimes animals, sharing warmth in a way that felt natural and essential. In this carefully choreographed nightly ritual, sleep was more than rest. It was protection against the cold, the damp, than illness. It was a celebration of comfort and status. It was a sensory experience of warmth, fragrance, sound, and light. Medieval nights were not merely endured, they were cultivated, nurtured, and for those who could afford it, luxuriously orchestrated. Sleep, then in the Middle Ages, was an art. Every element, clothing, bedding, companions, warmth, scents, rituals, combined to create an environment in which rest could flourish, dreams could visit safely, and the body could be renewed for the challenges of dawn. In smaller rooms, people often shared beds in twos or threes, especially where the fireplace was only lit during the harshest frosts. Youth, of course, gave them resilience. They could endure the cold more easily, and sometimes even turned it into a challenge, seeing who could sleep the longest without an extra blanket. Servants, however, had a very different experience. They often slept in communal quarters, sometimes 10 to 15 people in one room. Fireplaces were rare. At best, a single hearth served the entire group. Their beds were simple, straw-filled mattresses on wooden platforms, covered with coarse wool or sheepskin. Still, people found clever ways to stay warm. Chronicles from castles like Angers describe servants sleeping together like a litter of puppies, sharing body heat so that each individual could survive the chill. Kitchen staff and stable hands faced the toughest conditions, often sleeping near their workplaces. Cooks could snuggle up next to the warmth of the ovens, while grooms found the company of horses surprisingly cozy. Even within the servant class, there was a hierarchy of warmth. Senior staff, like stewards, cooks, or chaplains, sometimes had small rooms with their own fireplaces, while junior servants were confined to cold, shared dormitories. Female attendants of noblewomen held a slightly privileged position. They slept in warmer areas and could use leftover luxury items like old fur cloaks or scraps of fine cloth to add warmth. One amusing story from the Castle of Dover in 1398 tells of a young page who was so cold in his tiny room that he snuck into the stable and slept beside a lord's horse for warmth. Instead of being punished, he was allowed to continue this all winter. The horse's body heat was remarkably comforting. Clergy had their own arrangements. Chaplains and priests typically had private rooms with fireplaces necessary for their duties. Monks, by contrast, often slept in near-freezing conditions as part of their ascetic practices, though abbots and priors enjoyed warmer quarters. Complaints about the cold were common across all social levels. Nobles grumbled if their rooms required an extra night robe. Knights found woolen socks essential, and servants were grateful for any spot near a hearth where the stone walls were even faintly warm. Interestingly, this system of layered warmth had real consequences. Historical records show that the upper classes often lived 10-15 years longer than commoners, largely due to better sleeping conditions that strengthened immunity and helped withstand illness. In medieval castles, there was a clear principle. The higher your social rank, the warmer your bed. Looking at this from today's perspective, much of what the Middle Ages practiced is surprisingly modern. Thick walls as heat reservoirs, small windows for energy efficiency, and layered bedding are all echoed in contemporary passive house design. The ritual of layering blankets is still familiar. We just use synthetic fills instead of wool or fur. Pre-sleep routines like warming baths, hand massages, or hot drinks are recommended even now for better rest. Even the concept of living hot water bottles survives in a modern form. Electric blankets and heated throws have replaced dogs and cats by the bedside. Japan has even designed robotic pets to keep elderly sleepers warm, a fascinating modern echo of medieval ingenuity. The Middle Ages also taught the value of sleeping together. Science now confirms that shared beds help people retain warmth and sleep more soundly. Of course, today we usually limit this to a partner or pet rather than an entire household of relatives and servants. What should we skip from the medieval model? Perhaps sleeping in socks all night, unless your home is a drafty castle. The idea of going unwashed for weeks is also a myth, but overall, the key lesson remains. Comfort is a system, not a single solution. Architecture, heating, bedding, clothing, evening rituals, and social support all work together to create restorative sleep. Medieval people understood that good sleep depended on attention to many small, interconnected details. They also excelled at appreciating simple pleasures. A warm bed, a full meal, and a roof overhead were sources of real happiness. Today, we often take central heating, hot water, and soft mattresses for granted, yet still complain about our sleep. Perhaps sometimes it helps to imagine yourself as a medieval noble, having a brazier of hot coals delivered to your icy chamber. Suddenly, your modern apartment feels downright luxurious by comparison. From icy myths to cozy realities, it's clear that our ancestors were masters of nighttime comfort. They not only survived harsh conditions, but turned stone walls and cold nights into opportunities for warmth, care, and even a touch of luxury. And while modern technology makes life easier, the wisdom of centuries still offers lessons. Sometimes looking back is the best way to improve the present. So tonight, as you slip into bed, may your sleep be as warm, secure, and comforting as that of a medieval castle's inhabitants, who understood the true art of rest.